Hello viewers. In this session we shall discuss on module 44. In this module we discuss about trade indifference curve and its derivation. Here we shall discuss the derivation of trade indifference curves as proposed by Professor Mead. Then we shall discuss about the properties of trade indifference curves. And finally, we shall discuss about the link between trade indifference curves and offer curve. International trade equilibrium is generally illustrated in terms of offer curves. Now, the derivation of offer curves was first illustrated by Marshall and Edgeworth. But this method of deriving offer curve as proposed by Marshall and Edgeworth was abandoned mainly due to two reasons. First, the method is very laborious and time consuming, and the second reason is that it is inadequate to analyze the effects of said tariff on the welfare level of the tariff imposing country accurately. In this respect, Professor Mead proposed an alternative approach of deriving offer curves that is distinctly superior to the earlier cumbersome procedure. The derivation of trade indifference curves in order to derive offer curve was first proposed by Leontiev and Lerner in the early 1930s, but it was properly framed by Professor Mead in 1952 in his work The Geometry of International Trade. Mead's derivation of offer curve is composed of two steps. First, the trade indifference curves are derived from the country's production possibilities frontier and community indifference curves. And at the second step, the offer curves of the country is derived from the trade indifference curves and the terms of trade lines. One very common criticism against the Marshallian offer curve is that it considers only the demand side of international trade and ignores the production or supply side. It is also pointed out that the production of exportable and importable is constant. That means production of importable and exportable does not change in the method of deriving offer curve proposed by Marshall, and exportable and importable production is constant. The country enters into international trade with a fixed amount of its exportable in order to get more and more importable from its trading partner. But Professor Mead shows that the criticism against Marshallian offer curve is not correct. Professor Mead proposed the technique of deriving offer curve from the country's production possibilities, frontier, and community indifference curve, and for that, it is proved that the demand side as well as the supply side of international trade are considered while deriving offer curve. The device of constructing offer curve as proposed by Professor Mead shows that at what terms of trade the country will be neither better off nor worse off in terms of its international exchange with other country given a particular level of income. Trade indifference curve represents various combinations of exports and imports at which the country is indifferent. In other words, trade indifference curve is the locus of different combinations of exports and imports of a country for which the country will get same level of welfare, and therefore the country will be indifferent for all the trade combinations. Now, the country's trade indifference curve can be derived from production possibility frontier and community indifference curves. For each community indifference curve, one trade indifference curve can be derived. trade indifference curve represents the welfare level of that community indifference curve corresponding to which the particular trade indifference curve is derived. Now we can illustrate the derivation of trade indifference curve diagrammatically. First, we consider a simple exchange economy. That means the economy is endowed with a particular level of a commodity that the country exports. Let us look at the diagram to illustrate the derivation of trade indifference curve for a simple exchange economy. A simple exchange economy is that the country is endowed with a fixed amount of its exportable. Here, in this diagram, from origin O, we measure vertically upward consumption of Y and we measure horizontally leftward consumption levels of X. So, in the second quadrant of this diagram, we can draw the community indifference curves for the country. Here, the community indifference curves are labeled as I1, I2, I3, I4, and so on. And each community indifference curve represents a particular level of social welfare that is also denoted here within the bracket, that is U1, U2, U3, and so on. So, community indifference curve I1 represents the social welfare level U1. Similarly, community indifference curve I2 represents the social welfare level U2, and so on. Now, here we consider one point A on the community indifference curve I2. Now, the coordinates of point A, that is AV and AU, denote the consumption levels of commodity X and commodity Y by the country, for which the country can attain the utility level or welfare level U2. Now, we assume that the country is endowed with a particular level of commodity X that is represented by O prime. Now, O prime is considered as a new origin. From O prime, we measure vertically upward imports of commodity Y and we measure horizontally in leftward direction imports of commodity X. So, from O prime origin, if we look at these curves I1, I2, I3, then the curves will be trade indifference curves. Why this is so? Because if we consider the coordinates of the same point A with respect to origin O prime, what we get? Exports level of commodity X, that is endowment level of X, O prime, minus the consumption level of commodity X, that is OU. So, volume of export of commodity X is O prime U. And at point A, the distance AU represents the volume of import, because the country is endowed with zero level of commodity Y at the beginning, but the country is consuming AU amount of commodity Y. So, AU amount of commodity Y represents volume of imports of the country. So, the coordinates of point A with respect to origin O prime represent one export-import combination for the country. Now, similar logic can be applied for all the points A, B, C, D that lie on the same community indifference curve I2. The coordinates of all the points A, B, C, and D denote various consumption combination levels when we consider from origin O, and the coordinates of same points A, B, C, and D denote various export-import conditions when we consider from origin O prime. So, we look at the curves I1, I2, I3, and so on from origin O, then the curves are community indifference curves, and the same curves when they are considered with respect to origin O prime, then the curves will be trade indifference curves. Now, each trade indifference curve denote that level of welfare that the country can attain by exporting commodity X and importing commodity Y, which the country can also attain by consuming various combinations of the two commodities. Let us now analyze the derivation of trade indifference curve in general case. For that, we look into this diagram. Here, from the origin O, we measure vertically in upward direction positive quantities of commodity Y, and in downward direction we measure negative quantities of commodity Y. Again, from origin O, we measure leftward positive quantities of commodity X, and we measure horizontally in rightward direction negative quantities of commodity X. So in the second quadrant, we draw the community indifference curves I1, I2, and so on, representing social welfare levels U1, U2, so on. Now, here we have drawn the production possibility frontier in the second quadrant, that is OP, P prime. In general case, shape of the production possibility frontier is concave to the origin. So here it is concave, and we see that this production possibility frontier is tangent with the highest possible community indifference curve I0 at point E. So, under autarky, the country is producing and consuming at point E that lies on the community indifference curve I0 that enables the economy to attain the welfare level U0. Next, we shift this production possibility block, that is OPP prime, along the community indifference curve I0. We shift this production possibility block along this I0 community indifference curve in such a way that we get another tangency point between production possibility frontier and the community indifference curve I0 at point G. Now, here the coordinates of point G with respect to origin O represent the combinations of the two commodities the country will consume. Again, the coordinates of point G with respect to origin F will show the combinations of commodity X and commodity Y the country will produce. Now, comparing these production and consumption levels of the two commodities, we can get the export-import combination corresponding to this point G. Here we can see that at point G, the country is consuming commodity X by the amount GJ, that is OH, and the country is producing commodity X by the amount GK. So, the surplus amount of commodity X, that is JK, which is equal to OX1, is the volume of export. Again, the country is consuming commodity Y by the amount GH and it is producing GN. So, the country is importing commodity Y from another country is by the amount NH, that is equal to OY1. So, we get here the coordinates of point F, that is OX1 and OY1, represent export-import combination for the country, and this export-import combination enables the country to attain the same level of welfare that the country was enjoying at the autarkic level, and that welfare level is U0, represented by the community indifference curve I0. Now, other export-import combinations that will enable the country to attain the same level of welfare U0 will be obtained by following the same method. And the locus of these points, that means the locus of the corner point of this production possibility block, is the trade indifference curve that represents welfare level U0 that the country gets from the social welfare curve or the community indifference curve I0. So here we get the trade indifference curve represents the same level of welfare that the country can attain at a particular community indifference curve. And here trade indifference curve is derived corresponding to one community indifference curve, and the welfare level that the community indifference curve is representing, the trade indifference curve corresponding to that community indifference curve will also represent the same level of utility. It is to be noted that for each community indifference curve, one trade indifference curve can be derived. Here, if we want to derive a trade indifference curve corresponding to the community indifference curve I1, then we shall place the production possibility block in such a way that the block will be tangent with the community indifference curve I1. Then we shall follow the same method. That means we shall shift the production possibility block along the community indifference curve I1, and the locus of the corner point of the production block will give rise to another trade indifference curve that will represent social welfare level U1 that we get from the community indifference curve I1. Now, as I1 community indifference curve lies above and to the left of I0 community indifference curve, similarly, the trade indifference curve corresponding to I1 community indifference curve, that is T1, will lie above and to the left of T0 trade indifference curve, which corresponds to the I0 community indifference curve. After discussing about the derivation of trade indifference curve, we can now mention the properties of trade indifference curves. One trade indifference curve can be derived from one community indifference curve, and one trade indifference curve represents the welfare level of that community indifference curve corresponding to which the particular trade indifference curve is derived. In this diagram, we can say that T0 trade indifference curves represents the social welfare level of I0 community indifference curve, as we have drawn T0 trade indifference curve corresponding to I0 community indifference curve. Similarly, T1 trade indifference curve represents the welfare level of the I1 community indifference curve, as we have drawn T1 trade indifference curve corresponding to I1 community indifference curve. Next, the slope of the trade indifference curve depends on the slope of the community indifference curve corresponding to which the particular trade indifference curve is drawn. If the community indifference curve is downward sloping, then the trade indifference curve will also be downward sloping. If the community indifference curve is convex, then the corresponding trade indifference curve will also be convex. Next, we can say that the slope of the trade indifference curve at any point is equal to the slope of the production possibility frontier and community indifference curve at the corresponding point. Looking at this diagram here, the slope of the trade indifference curve at point F is equal to the slope of the production possibility frontier and I0 community indifference curve at point G. Here at point G, the production possibility frontier and I0 community indifference curves are tangent to each other. Therefore, their slopes are same at point G, and the slope of the trade indifference curve at point F is also same as the slope of the production possibility frontier and I0 community indifference curve at point G. Next, we can say about the link between trade indifference curves and offer curve. After deriving trade indifference curves in this way, we can superimpose the terms of trade lines or the price lines on the same diagram where the trade indifference curves are drawn. Then we can locate the tangency points between the terms of trade lines and the trade indifference curves. Now the locus of those tangency points between the terms of trade lines and trade indifference curves will be the offer curve. here, if the shape of the trade indifference curves changes, then the tangency points between the trade indifference curves and terms of trade line will also change, and therefore their locus, position of the locus will also change. So it is clear that offer curve depends on trade indifference curves, and trade indifference curves depend on community indifference curve and production possibility frontier. Hence, in this method, Professor Mead has proved that the derivation of offer curve depends on both demand side and production or supply side of international trade, as derivation of trade indifference curve depend on community indifference curve and production possibilities frontier. Therefore, offer curve also depends on production possibilities frontier that represents the supply side, and community indifference curve that represents the demand side of international trade. So, in this session, we have learned what is trade indifference curve, what is the use of trade indifference curve in international trade theory analysis, and then we have discussed elaborately the method of deriving trade indifference curves. We have considered two cases here. First, we discussed about the derivation of trade indifference curve in single exchange economy, where the country is endowed with a fixed level of exportable. After that, we have discussed about the derivation of trade indifference curve in general case, where the country enters into trade with some amounts of both exportable and importable. Next, we discussed about the properties of trade indifference curves in detail. And finally, we mentioned about the link between offer curve and trade indifference curves. Here, I have told you that how offer curve can be derived from trade indifference curves. Keep in our mind that the analysis of trade indifference curves is required to derive the offer curve. Professor Mead has shown that how offer curve can be drawn from trade indifference curves and how trade indifference curves can be derived concretely through a very beautiful geometric technique. Thank you.